What happens when untreated mental health illness turns to self-harm, harm of others, or worse yet, murder, as it occurred on Valentine's Day of 2018 at the tragic scene of Marjory Stoneman Douglas, where 17 students and staff members were slaughtered by a mentally ill criminal convicted, Nikolas Cruz. I am Robert Asencio. I'm here with David Magnusson, retired police chief, my co-host, and we have the great honor today, joined by Dr. Shari Schwartz, a forensic psychologist, professor at FSU, murder, if you will, court mitigator. Welcome, doctor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Today on episode 11 of The Silent Struggle. Can you believe we're already at 11?
Where does the time go?
Yeah. So much to talk about.
Yes.
We're going to be discussing, first of all, doctor, why don't you tell us what a forensic psychologist does? What is a forensic psychologist?
So a forensic psychologist is a psychologist who specializes in the intersection between psychology and the legal system. It's not always criminal justice. My expertise is in the criminal justice system, but sometimes it'll be in civil justice cases as well, like family law, things like that. For me, I like the criminal stuff, so that's where I work predominantly. I do a lot of death penalty work in the state of Florida mostly, juvenile work, juvenile murderers, and that's pretty much how I spend my time when I'm not in the classroom.
And you're also an authority, right? An expert witness, because we see you on national TV.
Thank you.
You have a national TV presence. You also have a presence around the state, which is really important in your line of work.
Thank you.
Lady of demand. But let's dive into, if you will, because for as much as has been said about Nikolas Cruz and his murder, mass murder at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, there's still much to be deciphered, right, for us to learn about. And as we examine the silent struggle, mental health, and we've already discussed the benefits of going and seeking help, there's certain people who just, no matter what, are broken. And no matter how much help they receive, they're just criminal. And I'd like to also go into the competency part, what made him competent to stand trial. But let's get into this. What caused this 19-year-old who was expelled from high school to commit these unthinkable acts of murder?
And that's always the question, the why. When we see these cases, Nikolas Cruz, other school shooters, other perpetrators of mass violence, we always want to know why. What makes them tick? What gets them to this point? And how is it that no one really noticed? Now, the fact is, with Nikolas Cruz, we know because we had an entire lengthy trial here in South Florida, so we know a little bit more about him and his life. And in his particular case, it seems like there were signs that he needed help. He was posting on social media. The school had required him to come to school with a clear bag because they had concerns that he was potentially a danger. And yet no one really knew what to do about it. No one, of course, could fathom that he was going to perpetrate the kind of violence that he did. And I think what it seems like to me is that there was a lot of empathy for him because he had a tough life. He definitely had a tough life. As tough as it can be, I guess, living in Parkland, right? We know this is a higher socioeconomic status. He had a trust fund that his mother left him, but he had a rough start. His mother that left him money and that took him in Parkland wasn't his biological mother. And so we learned through the trial that his biological mother was...
That was Linda Cruz, right?
Correct, I believe
His
so.
stepmother.
Yes, that was his
or
stepmother.
foster.
But I think she became his biological mother. I believe she adopted him, but I may not be entirely correct about that. Excuse me. But his biological mother was deeply troubled. His biological sister came and testified at the trial And she was raised with the mother, and she talked about how deeply disturbed the mother was. So in his case, it seems to be something that was genetic, at least in part.
Yeah, yeah. I think his mom, biological mother, was classified as a violent criminal offender.
That wouldn't surprise me. I don't know that fact for myself, but that would not surprise me. And you can kind of see in his case, you can connect those dots and see that in some ways he never had a chance. But in terms of competency, the difficulty that we have is we know that he's got some level of competency. When we talk about competency, we're talking about his ability to understand the charges against him, what his attorney is supposed to do for him, what the judge's role is, what the state, what their goal is where he's concerned. And so the bar to be deemed competent is relatively low. In his case, if he was deemed incompetent, I think that would have raised a lot of eyebrows, because here was somebody that planned this event, right, for lack of a better word, goes into the school that day, and he knows exactly how he's going to get in there with this weapon, exactly what he's going to do, and then filters out when everyone else is running out of the school, right? So this is somebody who has the ability to plan. And this is one of the difficulties we have when we're talking about somebody who's so mentally ill that they warrant empathy and that they need treatment, but at the same time that they're capable of this level of planning and violence. It's a really difficult issue.
Yeah.
You know, the word in all the episodes, and it pops up now, empathy. Okay. And I think it's worth saying right off the bat here that the very, very, very vast majority of people with mental health issues are not violent. They're more victims than they are offenders. But there's also that fine line here, because you certainly brought it up very well in the point that he was able to plan. He was able to go through that. So that was sort of like a catch-22 for him. But I don't know, at least for me, put law enforcement aside, where the empathy just ceases to exist in my eyes for somebody like that. This goes beyond violence. I mean, we've seen issues that people have mental health struggles, and maybe they hit somebody, like somebody coming out of the store the other day, it was on TV, and for whatever reason, sucker punched somebody coming out, an older man. We saw that. But this takes it to a level, the planning and stuff. And one would even argue that you sort of have to be having mental issues to even plan something like this, unless it was based on, hatred, where like the guy that went into the synagogue, it was based on hatred. This was violence. I mean, I'm sure there was hatred involved. It wasn't targeted for hatred per se, like the synagogue shooting, the mass shooting. But here you have a situation where we, the community, is supposed to be empathetic to somebody like this. The guy's a monster. And that may not answer the questions from a psychological point of view in a professional sense, but what got this guy from here to here? We understand he had a rough childhood. Nobody can argue that. Where did it go off on the rails? I mean, let's
back it up a little bit. Okay, let's break it down a little bit, right? So Nikolas Cruz had been known as a troubled child since he was an very, very young adolescent, right? Dr. Stephen Moskowitz, I guess he treated him, mental health care, psychiatrist, right? Treated Nikolas Cruz from an early age, diagnosed him with ADHD, oppositional defiance, and then later on, disorder, right? And then later on, as years passed, he was also diagnosed with having anxiety, depression, which exhibited itself in his communications, right? The postmortem autopsy of his actions revealed that he had been posting on social media. He's spoken about, he was misogynistic, he was hateful, he was xenophobic, he was anti-Semitic, he was racist in his comments, right?
Yes.
We're just going based on his comments. So the signs were there. here's a guy that killed animals. He's on a mission, right? Killed animals, burnt, created arsons or little fires, right? Was mean and cruel, downright cruel to his adoptive mother. I think he threatened that if she didn't kill herself, he would kill her. So all the signs were there. He had been Baker acted by the school resource officer. So the signs were there, but then that's a big leap to go from, and you know this when we've investigated people, right? Mm-hmm. It's a big leap to go from verbal and some actions to carrying an AR-15 into a school and mowing down innocent people. And that's what I like to discuss here.
Well, the thing is the difficulty, right, that police officers have, and you can speak to this more than I can, but we have a system that's reactive, more so than proactive, right? There's some proactivity on the part of police, but other than going out and maybe talking to him or warning him or charging him with what can be charged because of behavior that he perpetrated, we don't proactively punish people for things that we think they might do. And this in a way...
And we don't want to criminalize mental health.
And we don't want to criminalize mental health, but when it crosses over to violence or the fear of violence, it becomes an issue, as I see it, it becomes an issue of, well, where does the mentally ill person who's potentially going to perpetrate violence or who has in the past, and we know this already, where do their rights end and the rights of the innocent begin? What rights did those children and the staff in that school that day have? And he killed 17 people, but he injured seriously another 17. This was massive. And it seems, based on watching the trial and watching some videotape of an evaluation when the state's expert evaluated him, and you listen to him talk about what he did and why he did it, it's very cold. Now, part of that could be flat affect, right? And in talking about having empathy for him, you can look at that, I can look at that and see that he's not well, right? I think even an untrained eye can look at Nikolas Cruz and say, there's something very, very deeply wrong here. So you can have empathy for him, but I think we have to be careful about taking empathy too far to where we're saying, oh, we have to really feel sorry for the seriously mentally ill individuals at the expense of everyone else. I think there has to be a balance. We have to recognize that it's a problem. We have to recognize that we need to do better in terms of identifying the potential for this kind of harm and getting out in front of it as best we can. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. I have some ideas, but I don't know for sure. I think a lot of people would disagree with
you want to share?
Sure. Well, I think, to the point that we look at somebody like Nikolas Cruz, and as you pointed out, he had been in treatment for years, and clearly it wasn't helping. Right? He's posting these things online. He's filled with hatred. He's perseverating on this hatred. And when I say perseverating, I mean, your brain is on a loop. It's all that's going on, all 24/7. These are your thoughts, and so it gets worse and worse and worse. And so in that situation, it seems to me that possibly cannot be helped for whatever reason. Do I advocate walking around the streets and picking off people who maybe could perpetrate violence and lock them up? No, I'm not saying we should warehouse mentally ill people, but I'm saying there has to be some better mechanism in place than what we have. And it would require a lot of people to come together to figure out what that is, right? Not just me, to get that person off of the street. This goes beyond, to me, red flag laws or yellow flag laws where we're identifying people and keeping guns out of their hands. I think that's a good start. But for somebody like him, okay, so they keep the gun out of his hands for what, a few days, a few weeks, and then he files to get his weapons back, and then what? Right? So these are good starts, but I think that we really need to have these tough conversations about what direction do we want to take. You know, a lot of people talk about gun control. I think that's important. I'm not going to say that it's not. Of course it is, but it's not, as I see it, going to solve the whole problem.
There's no doubt that this issue of a school shooter, active shooter, period, because then we had the one in the, what was it, Card in New York.
You're talking about where?
Around
Lewiston?
Lewiston,
Lewiston, Maine, yeah.
Lewiston, Maine, I'm sorry. Lewiston, Maine. It's not just there been so many. Buffalo. So we know that this issue extends beyond firearms. I mean, firearms have made it easier for them to commit mass atrocities, but these people are ill. What are your thoughts from a law enforcement executive? How do we treat this? How do we address this growing issue?
You summed it up well. We're moving towards, okay, when can we take action? When can we take action? But as you alluded to, you can't round up people based on what you think they may happen. So you cross this line here, and then it's too late. It is a quandary. It's a big quandary. And let me go back and do the comparison. Again, I made mention of the synagogue shooting. Let's compare it to Dylan Roof. Let's take when he was caught in South Carolina in the church there. Yeah. And when they asked him in the interview, and I was able to watch that interview, well, why did you stop shooting? And with a smirk, he says, I ran out of ammunition. Now, that was based on hatred, but there's that calculating. There's no difference here. And again, I'll play the devil's advocate, mental illness aside. Evil is evil is evil. And I'll go back to the point that the vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent. They're not bad people.
I'm glad you're pointing that out.
And I think that's incredibly important. I think it's a kickstart when somebody's just evil. Now, you can say they had a bad childhood, but I can tell you the vast majority of people with bad childhoods don't go out and kill people. So I consider it, I'm not going to insult and say it's a cop-out. It's not a cop-out. There's a serious issue there. But, you know, I think we need to close the gap in some sense.
From law enforcement perspective, right? As an executive of police department, how do you better train your officers? I know Miami-Dade, we've said it before, we're leaps,
of course,
ahead of many other areas, regional areas, in law enforcement, policing. However, when it comes to dealing with and identifying the really criminally ill versus the one who's ill and needs help, how do we? Sadly,
the police aren't going to be able to identify it until they're in the midst of something going down at that moment.
That sucks, man.
Because if you are in contact with somebody on the street, you know, we've talked about it with Judge Steve Leifman and everything, with the CIT program. Obviously, they may be going through crisis, but it's not at that level at most of the time. They'll deal with it, and the person may get treated, may not. What's happening is off-site somewhere. They're plotting and planning. This didn't just happen. He was planning to go and wreak hell on unsuspecting students that he went to school with. At that time, it's too late, and I think that's the point here. Those that are that violent, you know, and combine that with their mental health issue, combine that with a high-capacity assault weapon.
Horrible ingredients.
It's a recipe for disaster. So how do we, you know, we talked a little bit a few minutes ago about the gun control. Okay, but a person can still find the gun. You'd be surprised how many people think of their cars as gun safes. It's not difficult to come across a firearm. And even if it's just a semi-auto with 18 rounds, that still can take out 18 people. Okay. The question that I see evolving here is those people that have mental health issues that are violent, how does police get to them before they commit the act? I don't know, because it usually doesn't happen that way until they're in the act.
I think it goes back to see something, say something, right? Doctor, was from what you've been able to gather, was Nikolas Cruz retaliating, or he was just some out of reality, committing an act, like a video game act? I mean, what are your thoughts?
On that, I think it depends on who you ask. I mean, I didn't work on the Cruz case, so I don't know all of the specific details. It certainly seems to me that he had significant mental health issues that didn't go entirely undetected because he was treated. And that's why it's really important to examine his case, because from an early age, he's seeing mental health professionals who are treating him and diagnosing him and doing everything. I mean, his mother, Linda Cruz, she's doing everything she can to get him the help that he needs. The school identifies him as a potential risk, and yet he still perpetrates this level of violence. From my perspective, I think it's probably not just one thing. It's probably a number of things. The first thing is a diseased mind, right? But other factors may be, I want to be famous. I want to go down in history. You know, this is, I'm going to make my mark. It's revenge in his mind, possibly. I don't know. I never talked to him. I didn't work on the case. But just when you look at all of these different shootings, there's a whole lot of things. But what's at the heart of it is these are people who have some sort of psychological disturbance. It might not even be long term. It might be, you know, a psychotic break in the moment. We know with Nikolas Cruz, it was long term. We know with a lot of these mass violence perpetrators, it is a long term issue. But at the same time, they're going out there, they're perpetrating this violence. And so what's at the heart of it is they're sending a message, right? They have some rage, they want to release the rage, whether it's part of a long-term serious mental illness. And I would argue that in most cases, it's not, right? The National Institute of Mental Health breaks down serious mental illness versus any mental illness. Any mental illness does include serious mental illness. When we think of serious mental illness, the way that they categorize it, it is something that really interferes with somebody's daily functioning. Things like schizophrenia, other psychotic disorders, the level of depression and anxiety that's pathological, right? Bipolar disorder, things like that. Not really personality disorders, which I think in Nikolas Cruz's case, there was a lot of any mental illness going on, the other category. You know, it doesn't seem like he was somebody who had schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder.
David, you want to say something?
Let me ask you a question here. We're talking about Nikolas Cruz, but going back historically, can we learn stuff? For instance, Adam Lanza, Sandy Hook, the lessons that were taught and that weren't picked up on there. Is that something that moving forward, which would have brought it from that time a couple of years later to down here at Parkland, is that something that could have been brought to forefront that people would notice now, maybe in some sort of a digest or something, the Adam Lanza case, and at which point now the brighter minds can pick up on it and say, okay, yeah, we see this is coming. What I'm getting at is there has to be lessons learned when these things happen so you can push forward. We've been talking about what can we do? And it's not a very positive response. What can we do before it happens? I'm wondering if the Lanza case, even Klebold, back there from Columbine, and those cases, what has been learned and what can assist us now moving forward? Does that occur?
Well, from a psychological perspective, we're certainly learning more about the types of behavioral characteristics that are, you know, observable, that are evident. But I think one of the human condition, human nature is what stands in the way of really being able, and the law, but really being able to identify it and seeing it as a serious threat. I say that because the case of Ethan Crumbley, who I think it was Michigan, somewhere in the Midwest, he was a school shooter 3 years after Parkland, is writing disturbing things in a notebook. He's drawing disturbing images and letting them be seen. He asked his parents to take him to a mental health professional because he wasn't well. Their response was they bought him a gun, right? And this happened with Adam Lanza's family too. His mother bought him a cache of weapons. But the school counselor, and I don't want to be hard on the school counselor because I don't believe for a moment the school counselor intended any harm to come to any of the students in that school, especially Ethan. The school counselor gets hold of the notebook. The teacher turns him in, I believe is how it went down, pulls him into the office, calls the parents to the school. The parents are annoyed that they're being called to the school. And the school counselor says to him, okay, Ethan, go back to class. But he tells the parents, you have to get him psychological help. Ethan, go back to class. And it was within a couple of hours that he shot up the school and killed people. So I think part of it is the human condition that we think that happens elsewhere. We think that happens to other people. We just don't believe it would happen to us.
How about the enabling portion? Lance's mother was enabling. Ethan, parents were enabling. Cruz's mother wasn't, though. She tried to get the help, or am I wrong? She did try to get him the help, right?
It seems like she did. He was seeing counselors. He was probably having support at school as well, would be my guess, because the school was aware of him and identified him as a potential problem. So there is that. I mean, we don't really know what was going on in the home. I seem to recall vaguely that his mother was ill.
Yes.
So I don't know how, and I don't even know that, the traditional kind of discipline that we think of, if that really would work, right, in somebody with a diseased mind.
I think I would add the fact from all the reading I've done is that the parent, because before the mother, it was the dad and stepdad and the mother. Dad dies,
Right.
and then the mom dies. 3 months before the incident? They were ill prepared to deal with somebody who had so much problems. Right? It was so sick. One thing to point out, although this case and any other shooting, there are victims that actually die, those that are injured. I think the injuries extend well beyond in MSD, the 17 who were shot. Because I would say that there were a couple thousand kids, nearly 2,000 kids in that building.
Yes.
I would say the majority of them are actual victims, and the teachers, right, and in the community, because there's a lasting effect. So bringing it closer to home to the silent struggle in the last 3 minutes, I guess what it boils down to is appropriate care, but identifying those that are sick early enough, those that need help, because just because they have a little mental health, and I say a smaller case of mental health illness, now does not mean if it's treated, it can be corrected, right? Like you always say, a broken arm can be mended, and a physical injury can be healed. But mental health illness can spiral out of control, and it's identifying those that need to help, getting them help, and that often includes self-help, reaching out for help. Can you talk to people about the audience about the benefit of seeking help?
Well, I think had Nikolas Cruz reached out for help, and to my knowledge, he did not.
He was just acting out.
Because
no, he
maybe he didn't think he needed it. That's another feature of a diseased mind. They may not feel like they need it. And I do want to highlight that it's not just about identifying those that are mentally ill. It's about identifying that small subset that are mentally ill and have this potential for violence. And the thing is, and it is a small subset, even though it doesn't feel like that, because we now have social media and internet, and so we are hearing almost daily about these mass violence events. So it seems like it's this major epidemic of people running around who have this intersection of the mental health disturbance and this ability to be so violent. I don't think it is that huge, but it's clearly big enough, and it's having enough of an impact that we have to pay attention to it. And so if these individuals can't identify that they need help, then it becomes incumbent upon people who are interacting with them, most of whom aren't trained to identify if somebody needs help. And understand, these people, these perpetrators, aren't necessarily going up to people and saying, sometimes it happens, but usually it doesn't happen, that they're coming up to people and saying, I'm going to get a weapon and I'm going to shoot up people. And even in cases where that has,
as it did in this case,
right, people say,
The leakage.
oh, come on, you don't, just angry. Don't say that. You shouldn't say that, because you could get in trouble for that. Because it's so hard to fathom that somebody's actually going to do that. Although, to me, that excuse is kind of waning because I think it's much easier to fathom now. If somebody tells you, I'm going to do this to even one person, you have to believe them. We don't have the luxury of saying, no, you don't mean that. I didn't take it seriously.
Consequences are too great. David, we have 30 seconds. You want to close us out?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I mean, this isn't going to, in 30 seconds or an hour or 10-hour show. There's just too many questions, too many things we can't answer right now. Mm-hmm. But I will ask this, in this sense, that what's the next shoe going to fall? Where's that going to be? What's out there that we don't know today?
Mm-hmm.
And
what can we prevent? Right. So on that note, we have so much more to discuss. Mm-hmm. I hope you'll continue to join us.
Yes, of course.
We know that there's going to be no shortage of similar incidents, sadly. If we could only prevent them. Yeah. This has been episode 11 of The Silent Struggle. We have been speaking with Dr. Shari Schwartz, a forensic psychologist, professor at FSU, an authority in this topic of the intersection of psychology and the law. We have David Magnusson, retired police chief, myself, Robert Asencio. We thank the Millers at the Community News. We thank our producer, Rachel. Doctor, thank you so much. And you, the audience. We'll hope to speak to you next time. Drop us a line and let us know what you think.